No, it's individual. That's less than one ISO document. That's not a problem. That's not a problem. Understanding the type of paper, yeah, that's a little bit. So that's interesting. So I think come later. I mean, this is like after a few, and in fact, so we got the thoughts because they're just like, sorry, yep, I don't think we didn't. Well, most of it's and HIP protocol.
It exactly is.
No, we're not going to say that. We're too excited. That's right.
Welcome to the session of the Service Function Chaining Working Group. When you are not here for service function chaining, I would please you to leave the room and close the door. My name is Martin Stiemerling. I'm the new co-chair. Thomas and Jim cannot be here, unfortunately, so you have to live with me by today. I'm now going to display the node well, which you have seen by now. And while you're carefully reading this, I'm still looking for at least one minute taker who has to minute the decisions we make here. We don't need a word-by-word minute taker. And somebody who's looking at the Jabber room and its Jabber scribe. Volunteers. And just a side note, we are not going to start the session when we don't have a minute taker or Jabber scribe. For what? Minutes, okay. What is your name? Okay. Thank you. We have a minute taker. And now we need just a Jabber scribe. A Jabber scribe is basically looking at the Jabber room and looking if there's anybody raising a question. And if there's a question, you go to the mic and play the proxy. And maybe sometimes you have to tell the people which presentation we are currently in and what slide. Anybody volunteering for the Jabber scribe? Come on, that's an easy job. Thank you, Diego. So, all right. Everybody knows the blue sheet. If not, you will see there's a blue sheet coming by. You sign in your name and your affiliation. And let's see. So the agenda for today is we now do the agenda bashing. Then we look on an update on draft IETF NSH. We have a small discussion afterwards about the current implementation status. And this discussion is not meant to be conclusive, just like for an update, and so that also other people have the chance to say, like, we're working on the implementation, we are in that state, and we have made those experiences, for instance. After this, we have the SFC security discussion, and at the end, we have miscellaneous things and closing. The detailed agenda is we have Uri, who is presenting the NSH document and the current implementation status. We have the security discussions, and we have, for instance, the service chaining, the hierarchical at the end. There was one request for a draft, which we may take if there's time at the end. A hint for other people who have requested a presentation slot and didn't get any. Most of you have probably received an email saying you need to have email discussions on the list before you get the presentation slot. Please keep this in mind. It's probably not good if you come here and present a draft nobody has read until now, or nobody has even noticed on the list. Okay, any comments about the agenda? Okay, I think then we can start with Uri. Right, please. Let me see if I get your thing here. Where? Here, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, you can also take your laptop because I think this is dead. No. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, afternoon, everybody. I guess I have to stay within this box. So, hopefully, many of you have noticed the latest updates on the draft. How many have read version 3 or version 4? Okay, quite a few. So hopefully we'll get lively conversation. The reason we have 3 and 4 is that simply because we had to refresh number 3 in order not to get it expired, and then found few little other issues that we found on the list and we wanted to resolve. So we'll go over that. Next slide, please. No update for the list of authors and contributors here, but you will see that that has some striking and interesting relevance to the number of implementations we have, and I think we are very happy with the implementations that we have, and more are coming out. Not everything is still in the public domain. Next slide. A little bit of meat on this slide. So, few changes that we have made to the slide, to the draft. The first one, there was a lively conversation on MD type 1 and MD type 2. Some people argue that MD type 2 should be a must. I think we are finding consensus, or we'll find soon, at least that while we want to keep very good balance between hardware-based implementation, software-based implementation, and allow the protocol to be as flexible as possible, we need to drive the line in a reasonable fashion. And so the proposal that the draft carries right now is that MD type 1 has a fixed format, fixed length, which obviously is hardware friendly. And then what we do is, even though you may have an MD type 1 node, because all nodes have to be length aware, it means that you could do whatever you want with MD type 2, and all nodes would interpret that. So it gives you the flexibility that some of folks on the working group were looking for. At the same time, it keeps those more performance efficient and potentially limited or less flexible implementation that some people may want to do in hardware. And you'll see in some of the later slides that there are many of them already. I think we keep the right balance between the two options. The second comment related to this is has to do with the interpretation also of the length field. Again, not all nodes need to interpret the length field. But if you happen to have a node that is interested in accessing the original packet, the way you do that is by processing the length field. And with that, I think we can satisfy the requirements that people have. There was another open that had to do with adding a header always introduces the higher probability of fragmentation. There isn't anything special that this protocol is doing that others are not, and therefore the proposed remedy for that potential problem is exactly compliant with what the IETF suggests in general, and we simply list all of the options, pretty much text that you'll find in other drafts as well. The last comment here has to do with security considerations for those that remember the security conversation we had in the last few meetings. The concern was that some of the text may be a little bit too onerous, and then in some cases, one would have implementation in a location that has been secured other ways. So all the provisions that call for authentication between different elements of an SFC, those become user-driven based on the overall security parameters of the implementation, rather than read to the user who has not been exposed to the workgroup conversation as if those are always mandatory. Question.
Yeah. Mohamed Oukader, Orange. I have just one comment to make here is that it seems that there is a lot of participants in the working group that raised an issue about the MD type to be maintained as mandatory and the one that should be optional in the specification. And we are keeping raising the same question, but we don't hear any answer from on the mailing list, and the issues are still ignored by the editors. And we have raised also the questions about what is the rationale for instance, fixing the specification for fixed metadata, and we still don't receive any answer to that one. And is there any rationale why you have kept this one in the new revision and you didn't consider the comment that has been raised on the mailing list from various participants from the working group, or there are other reasons why you have done the choice? Thanks.
So if I got your question right, first of all, just to put, I think the facts right, correct me if you think I'm misquoting them, because I have no intention to misquote the facts. I'm just trying to make sure we are all communicating the same way. All of the tickets have been addressed. Maybe you didn't get the response you wanted, but nothing was ignored.
But who decides about the fix for the issues?
Well, the fix for the issues, I think, is the prerogative of the working group. There needs to be standard IETF kind of consensus, but specifically to the issue of the flexibility, I think that if what you are looking for is the optimal flexibility, you absolutely get that with MD type 2. And I don't think there is any reason to restrict those who seek optimal performance that could be provided by hardware-based implementation that by nature is being better served by knowing exactly what you're going to have to deal with. So the intention here is, that helps. The intention here is absolutely to serve both camps.
Maybe a question from me, Matt. Can can you send me a pointer to the issue which you believe has been ignored, just to double check? Yeah.
Yeah, I listened to
Okay,
the
thank you.
point.
Yeah, there's been like 10 different tickets.
Yeah, I know. It's
Yeah,
just
all
like-
of
yeah.
them have been addressed. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to reinforce what you said, is like it's the working group who has decided what's actually been done. But sometimes it might be difficult to figure out what the working group consensus is. That's so no, but the chairs can help. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so I don't know why it was posted as two different agenda options, and if you have dinner reservations, hopefully you could pull them in. But there's been very many implementations in open source, which takes us back to the IETF approach of give me at least 2 working implementations and then we could close the draft. I think we are way beyond that point. We could talk about not only the number of implementations, but actually the number of different communities that have adopted this technology, and more actually is coming. More is coming in OpenStack. More is coming in products, and what we have here in the next few slides is only that information that is publicly available, which is really a subset. It's only based on open source and what different vendors have been kind enough to make public announcement about. So the first one in the Linux kernel, we have work going on in the Linux kernel that has to do with, first of all, the simplification of handling routing in the kernel, but also with the issues of how we deal with VXLAN GPE and with NSH. The request has been that we split this into 2 different patches. The patches have been submitted more than once. It's a very lengthy process. The last patch that was done by Red Hat was submitted a few weeks ago, and we are still waiting for that to be upstreamed. The mechanism provided by lightweight tunneling has been used over there. Unfortunately, what happens is that the OVS implementation is kind of a cascading effect where it has to rely on the patches first being accepted into the kernel. And in OVS, what we have is that first the VTAP handles the packet, and only then you are handling the GPE NSH. So still we are making good progress that everybody can download and use today, where the classifier is now being controlled like any other element of vSwitch using OVSDB and OpenFlow combination, which enabled automation of that software that is part of the vSwitch residing on the server side. And then we have also decoupled the transport and the transport and the NSH NCAP decoup. Another community that has recently been announced as part of the Linux Foundation, fastdata.io, has some of those elements already implemented, like the NCAP decap in VPP. For those who have not been exposed to that, VPP is another layer that sits on top of technology like DPDK, allows a very rich set of network protocols to be accelerated, provide a fast and rich data plane on a server. One of the technologies that it supports is SFC. It has an element that is called honeycomb, which serves as an element that could be remotely controlled from your network controller. In this case, it is Open Daylight. Obviously, could be supported by any other community if you so choose. And so we are putting together the other pieces like the classifier, the SFF, and the proxy, so that over time FDIO is also going to have a full implementation of NSH. Next slide.
I have a number of questions. Just it's easy.
Sure.
So, who in this room is part of this community in sense of doing implementations?
Oh,
Okay, the people are also here. Okay, good. Because that will be my question. Like, how good is the intertraining between us here and the community? Are there also other operating systems under development? So Linux is one. Is there activities on FreeBSD, for instance, or?
I'm not aware of other operating systems.
Okay, good. All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
There could be, I'm not aware. Okay. Then after the data plane, there is very good progress on the control plane as well. I'll first cover what we have today and then cover the next, the plans for next phase. The control plane started with a group-based policy. That's a project that originally was contributed by Cisco, exists there for many years. Specifically, what happened in the last cycle for Open Daylight is that other players wanted to create network virtualization. In other words, call it a VXLAN manager that is done in a different way, still connects to OpenStack Neutron. And that's a project called NetVirt for network virtualization. That created an interesting situation where we could have two different projects that are calling on the vSwitch simultaneously. So we took few steps. One step was to carve out the classifier that originally was part of the group-based policy, and it became independent, and that is also useful for telco, not limited to telco, but it is used for, could be used for telco where somebody is not necessarily using concepts that are available in other projects in Open Daylight. And then because we have multiple projects that could be calling on the same vSwitch, and this is actually one of the artifacts of the OpenFlow architecture, where vSwitch is implemented as a sequence of tables, but there isn't a way to clearly decide who owns what table and in what order you are going to process that. And so a rule that you put in one table may affect something that happens in a later stage. It becomes kind of interesting and challenging to be able to control the way different projects or different writers in this context are interacting or interfering with each other on a vSwitch. One of the things that we did specifically to promote the SFC NSH is to allow coexistence of these two paths, and that is also available today with the Open Daylight Boron release. And then there was a refactor of the OpenFlow and renderer and Yang simply for better stability and performance. This is not where it stops. The next phase, which is Boron, which is slated to be released in Q4 of this year, is going to have much richer feature set that includes load balancing, failover, implemented in OpenFlow. So you could actually have a basic policy, and you could select different path for your SFC NSH traffic based on weights that you assign for that. You could have dynamic insertion and removal. So the control plane implementation is getting more and more full as we progress with time. That has also been demonstrated with OPNFV. OPNFV is obviously trying to put together a top-to-bottom stack that starts from what they call a Vim all the way down to the server. Recently, they added to the scope also the Meno layer. focused on the needs of telco for NAV SDN. One of the things that we are adding in the Open Daylight implementation of SFC NSH is the ability to use abstract data types. When you start thinking about how you deploy, one of the issues that you come across is the issue of, okay, how do I know what this virtual machine is? Is it a firewall? Is it a load balancer? And so the data types here are going to provide an easy mechanism by which one could tell this particular element is a firewall, and now what you could choose by means of policy is to say, okay, I need a firewall, and you could find all the instances and continue improving the control plane. Another thing that is happening actually in the next phase, I should have mentioned that earlier, is that today's implementation, and obviously these issues get exposed in the context of trying to integrate everything, and this is why it's important to talk about that with the context of OPNV, is that today you have to provide from the northbound APIs not only the information of what is DSF, but also an information about the SFF, and that actually causes few phenomena. Not only you're creating a relatively static relationship between the service function and the SFF, but also you have to expose what is an SFF to the northbound side of an orchestrator, which is not the place that it natively belongs. So one of the things that we'll be doing in the next release would be to avoid the need to expose that by simply enriching the understanding of Open Daylight of what SFC is, and therefore what Open Daylight would be able to do the minute it gets the handle for the service function, it is going to communicate with the right SFF, wherever that SFF or SFF in plural reside, in order to create the chain. Question?
Yes, this is Kent Leung. I'd like a clarification as far as how this maps. I guess one thing is to know how this maps to the control plane interfaces that's being defined for C1 to C4. You know, because like you said, you mentioned about a load balancer, and you know, I always find there's a distinction in load balancing in terms of one's load balancing the user traffic, and the other is load balancing to the SF instances, right? That's part of the SFC. So I mean, I think it'll be good to be able to map it to the control interfaces that's being defined. That way we know what the policy, what the configuration provisioning is for what we're trying to do. Otherwise, some of these, especially load balancing, I think it gets a little bit tricky and to understand exactly what the intent is.
Yeah, so just to repeat the questions, make sure I got it right, and for the benefit of others who may have not heard the question, the request has been to map these kind of interfaces to another draft that is being worked in this work group about the control planes and the different C interfaces. So two answers to that. One is to say that, first of all, we believe those implementations are fully compliant with the work that is going on over here, but still there are open source implementation. So we could work together in order to map them, but it is not necessary for the work group to do it because this is an independent implementation. Secondary, actually, when the draft came out, I think you got feedback at least from Paul, myself, I think Joel provided feedback as well, and maybe other individuals on how this maps. Happy to continue working with you. I don't recall, it's been a little bit of time, I don't recall there's been any major issue that surfaced, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, actually, I'm not an author on that draft. I was just trying to tie things together.
Sure.
I think there's some value to make sure they're in sync because like you said, there's implementation of open source. You don't want to go down a path that later on you may have to bring it back to line things up for the interfaces. That's all. It was just a comment. I'm actually not an author there.
Okay. Okay, so still, if anyone wants to work on this, and that work item has merit for folks, sure, no issue. Okay. Next one. So that's again a subset of the companies who publicly announced that they are either shipping or simply announce support. All of those companies, to the best of my knowledge and Paul's knowledge, we're working together on this deck, has been approached for and were positively responding, saying that that is the case. In some cases, there is more than one product that each of those companies have, and my company is included. So multiple implementations and multiple companies at the same time. Next slide. This is a little bit more boring slide, because honestly it is a slide that we used before. It has all sorts of public implementations, interops, and the industry, at least one of the industries that is interested in service function, and that is telco. In the last event that was just a month and a half ago, the key focus has been on actually taking the game higher in the stack to Mano. So to the best of my knowledge, and I wasn't there, I don't know that there was anything new about it, but there's been multiple interoperability demonstrations before. And that takes us to the last slide, which is, given all of that, we have asked about a week ago to start the last call process. We as a working group have been engaged with this discussion for quite some time. We have lots of implementation, as you could see. There are many good ideas on the table as to additional enhancement and additional details that are needed. We believe that some of them has high value, and the work group should pursue them, while at the same time there is no reason to hold back this draft that is already on its fourth rev, and honestly doesn't have any major changes. So we would like to proceed with that, and we also believe that it provides the right mechanisms that would allow the additional functionality that some of us would like to see. It would allow and support that additional functionality. That's it for me.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, questions, please.
I just have one question to one of the previous slides regarding the OpenN3, the data types. You mentioned that distinguish between, firewall.
Sorry, what slide?
Go back, one of the previous slides, back, another one back. This one, I think, for this one,
Okay.
control plane. You said that the OpenN3, there is data types which distinguish between, firewall and.
Yes.
So are these data types maps to the data path, or just on the control plane? I don't understand how it's work. I mean, this data.
Oh, okay. So the idea is, and for me, it's really one phase in the way I see the whole complete implementation evolves. It depends on who the user is and how high they want to build their stack. Right now, what OpenNV is doing is really integrating something that starts from, if you want, a cloud management system like OpenStack. It has an SDN controller like open daylight in this case, and then it has a vSwitch and a server. So if you restrict your scope to an environment like that, the notion that you have a data type is useful, because now you could state that the open daylight, at the SDN controller level, you could say, connect me to, in other words, the second service function in a chain should be a load balancer. And then you could actually, the SFF or the code that sits in the center in open daylight could give you a inventory of all of those load balancers that you have, and you could further take it into whatever policy you would like to employ, which of them you want to use for what purpose, and so on and so forth. When you set your scope differently, and when you go one layer higher, as an example, you want to go to a mono layer, and then you have a service orchestration and resource orchestration, you start adding those layers, you'll find that that maybe is not fully sufficient in order to do it, because it doesn't integrate, as an example today, with those concepts of descriptors that you get from the Etsy Mano work. But if you only work at that layer, as I described earlier, then you find them useful. In the future, these are open source communities, so all the progress that is being made is obviously governed by the release cycle and how much work you could put between one release to the next. And so what I think you're seeing here, you're seeing a very positive, powerful, vibrant forward progress in the way that the control plane is implemented, and those data types are simply the situation where you will find that community in the next phase. So depends on how you would like to position any given product, and that's outside of the IETF. We could talk about implementations outside.
Thank you.
Yeah.
George Karagiannis, Huawei. I have a question about the control plane that is implemented in Open Daylight. Do you know if the draft that has been specified in this working group has been used, and if yes, how, in what extent?
Yeah, so the question about Open Daylight control plane, whether the control plane draft that we have here has been used. I don't have positive indication that the draft has been used as such. That actually is a continuation of the question that was asked earlier. Really for two reasons. One, the implementation has actually three maybe. Implementation has started way before we had control plane. Second is that draft here. Second is that open source communities evolve simply based on contribution that people bring forward. They are not always or see it as a prerequisite for any implementation to go use the draft. And third, as I commented earlier, I don't know that anything from the top of my head, because it's been easily 3 months or something since I've commented on this. From the top of my head, I don't remember anything that is strikingly different. But if you're one of the authors, happy to work and happy to present next time whatever mapping there is. The changes could go both ways. I think one of the merits of open source implementation is that sometimes it gives you good guidance as to, oh, okay, let's see what was the reason somebody chose a different path. But again, just to summarize on this topic, the way one community like Open Daylight in this case has decided to implement the control plane is simply an industry example. It is obviously not mandatory for anything, and obviously it doesn't behoove the IETF to do anything specific.
Okay.
There is another person, so.
It's Kent Leong again. Just to add to that, right? My gut feeling right now is that you guys are not diverging, right? Because like you said, you started implementation and draft is happening, and I think you're doing some basic functions, right, for SF, SFF, and the classifier. I think what got me was that when you're doing to extend it to a load balancing capability and the additional functions that you want to expand, I think that's when we need to make sure that it's more aligned. That's my thought.
Sure. So again, no objection. Anyone who is willing to work on this, you'll find us very cooperative on this subject. Yeah.
Hi, I did not quite understand, I'm Anh Lee from NetCredit, not quite understand the previous question about load balancing. Do you guys talk about the cluster, for example, of service function like firewall or parental controls that the forwarder need to target as one SF identification?
Okay. So I think you're referring to the previous question, not the last one.
Yeah.
And so the point, this is about the abstract data types, right?
You know, also about the identification. So these firewalls, for example,
Right.
the service function in a cluster, we need to have the same identification for them, and the load balancing will, because from the one of the next service function in the chain, it's just one ID for the firewall
So
function.
let me make sure I understand the question and correct me if I'm wrong there. Today in the implementation, the way it really works is that while the orchestration is automated, one needs to say, let me describe the process a little bit in a more elaborate fashion, and maybe that's going to help us understand each other. So in an orchestration environment, I first have to go and place a virtual machine or any other element like container, doesn't matter, but let's use virtual machine as an example right now. I need to place it in one of the servers that I have. After it is being placed if we stick to the OpenStack example, that would be done by Nova. After that, I need to connect it to a network. In order to connect it to a network, it's a pretty elaborate process. I would employ something like Neutron. I'll get back a handle that says the port that relates to that virtual machine is something. Now, what we have is a virtual machine that is connected to a network, but there's no notion of a service function chaining at this point. So few things are missing. It is not really yet linked to any service function, and it is not clear what role that virtual machine is playing in that service function. So you need to add these notions that OpenStack, as an example, doesn't have native in it today. While there is industry work, and we are also involved in this to try and do this today, it doesn't exist over there. So the way you're doing it today, prior to the next release, is that you have to go and say, oh, okay, there are projects. As an example, there is a project called Tecker. What Tecker does, it is a project that is interfacing with OpenStack on one hand and with Open Daylight on the other end. It would go trigger something like HIT on OpenStack, and it's going to say, please go place a virtual machine for me. But then it's going to turn to Open Daylight and say, oh, by the way, this virtual machine that has just been placed needs to be a service function on some implementation. And therefore, give it, go educate an SFF, tell the SFF what is the SPI number, tell the SFF what is the SI number, so all of the details that we are doing with SFC and SH. But you are not done there, because now if you want to use that service function chaining, you have to have a preconceived knowledge of the second element in that service chaining is actually a firewall or a load balancer or a net or a DPI or LI or whatever you decide you want to do over there, which really means that your orchestration is still to some extent very intensive and you could say, quote unquote, still manual. The next step that you could think of is to say, kind of go the next level up in terms of how you define your policy. you could say, give me a service chaining that has the following elements in it. First, put there a firewall, then put there a load balancer, then put there some video compression or transcoding or whatever you have. And if you had support from the underlying layers where you could identify what element is really ready to serve as one of those roles, then you could automate your control plane even further. You could have 2 firewalls, and then you could even set parameters in a vSwitch that would say when to use each of them, so you create load balancing. So for that, you need the next level of abstraction. That's all what I was referring to.
Okay.
So those are all software layers that sit way above the NSH data plane that we have defined over here.
So you said that, okay, so the orchestrator need to design, pre-design.
Yeah, and we
first, or
could, I can show you some slides offline. It's going to make it so much
okay,
simpler.
so not about cluster of same instance of service function. Okay.
Okay. Anything else? Okay.
Okay, thank you. Then just a reminder, as said, the working group last call for the NSH document has just started. And it's required that you people and the people on the list, which is not the same set, but there's an overlap, read the draft and give you commands to the list. It's not good if there's no command, meaning silence. Read it. And especially people who are here and linked to the open source community, it would be good if we have implementers also reading this and giving feedback, because they can give feedback and saying, well, we could implement it, or this is unclear, or this is overspecified. Yeah? Okay, thank you. Then we come to the security part. Yeah. There we go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Is that better?
No.
Okay. So, well, first of all, I'd like to apologize for this late submission. But in fact, well, with the design team, we were expected to present the NSH requirement, just to make the difference between the requirements for the environments and the requirements that are associated to the NSH protocol. So, well, nonetheless, all the comments have been addressed right after the previous meeting. So it's not something we try to catch up, but we just published it late. So let's go next slide. So what is the scope of the document? So the security environment requirements are basically describing potential risk you expose when you deploy SFC. And we're trying to provide some guidance to minimize those risks. So the risk really depends on the assumptions of your deployment and the available options you have. These options might be NSH, but it might be also outside the NSH scope. And if there is a missing part, then you might use a specific NSH option, or we might use that to see there is a missing NSH option, and in that case, it should be designed. But in that sense, it's really different. Deployment is really different from requirement for NSH security. So in fact, the goal is just to make your deployment more robust and more stable. Next slide. So why we think it's important? Because SFC is a new technology, and it's mostly based on service, so you're going to have to handle some interesting data for attackers and some data people deploying SFC should take care of. And why we think people deploying SFC, because that's really the target, the people deploying SFC should read the document. It's to prevent malicious attacks, malicious intrusions, misconfigurations, understand the consequence of the decision you take for your deployment. For example, the future evolution of your deployment, if you're doing this or that, then you might have to take the future considerations of your deployment. And also to enable auditing and detection of misbehaviors. Next slide. Why these requirements are not intended to design secure NSH? Well, first of all, security options of NSH could be used within a secure deployment. So it's completely orthogonal. That's what I would say. Next slide. So the changes in version 0.1 are really to emphasize that security requirements depends on the assumptions of your environment. So it's not a list that you have to follow and check. No, you first have to say, what is the trust of my environment? What are the different criteria? And give it those criteria, then we provide guidance for you. So the text we added was mostly to illustrate and to clarify the goal, how authentications should be handled, how the metadata privacy, the audit logs aspects. And we also emphasize on testing. So by splitting the authorization and the control and the process of the SFC data plane, so that you can really test your deployment before it goes into the real world. Next slide. So, okay, I think it's not the last version. So we had a few questions to the working group, and we'd like your feedbacks. Before we go into the added text, we would like to understand what is your feeling about this document, and because it looks from the previous presentation that the fact that we said requirement, the working group was not really receptive because said, no, I don't want to do that. I have some cases where this and this, and I don't want to follow this requirement. And sometimes you were right. But is that something that maybe the term requirement might be too strong, and would you prefer seeing that as more recommendations or guidance? So that's one of the questions. And the other would be, well, we have must, should, but in terms of guidance, what's the real value in your opinion? What should be said must? What should be qualified as should? These are the two questions, and so if you can provide us some feedbacks, that would be very helpful to go forward, to move forward the document. So if you have any reaction now? No? So
maybe one of the good questions would be also, did anybody actually read the draft?
So has anyone read the draft version 1?
Smadra from F5 Networks. So I have a question about the authentication. When you say authentication, authenticate what? Service, user? And if you say user, I understand, but if you say service, okay, how is it?
So authenticating users, that's part of the access control to your data plane. So we mentioned some aspect of that, but it's rather in the testing. So we just say, that's different functions, and it's better not to have them combined. Then authentication was mostly considering the authentication of the NSH transactions, or, I mean, the traffic between the peers, NSH, service functions.
So is it same as adding a MAC digest?
MAC addresses?
No, MAC digest. Is it similar?
Oh, yeah, that's...
are you saying that?
Yeah, or signature, or...
Okay.
It depends on which layer you're doing that, because if you do, for example, metadata, you can use different mechanisms. But
okay.
Well, what is important is to understand why you should authenticate. And what is the impact of authentication? Because it's not the computation of computing a MAC or like encryption. It's not the problem of encrypting. The problem is doing it right and to manage the keys behind, because that's the real problem. So the recommendations are not how to do that, but more whether it's needed or not. And that really depends on what kind of data you're using, what is your assumption of your environment. If you say, well, it's a closed door, maybe authentication is not so much required, but still there is a risk. And the idea is really to tell you, this is the kind of risk you're exposed. Suppose you say, I don't want to authenticate because all these nodes are in the same data center and so on. And then, well, you want to expand the resource of your data center, so you want to go outside your domain. Then you have to see that if you're doing this, well, it's not the same assumption that you made before. So it's more this kind of things we are providing into the document. So, okay, so now let's go briefly to the added text. So this is the kind of thing we added. The goal of this document is to provide some security requirements. Well, one of the reasons I'm going through this is that I expect some feedbacks. So if you have any feedbacks, please stand up and take the mic. So the goal of this document is to provide some security requirements that should be checked against any evolution of the SFC architecture. The requirements should be understood, and the risk of not following them should be evaluated with the current deployment as well as the foreseen evolutions. Similarly, the document provides means to evaluate the consequence of a security breach as well as means to detect them. The motivation for the security requirements are preventing attacks, preventing misconfigurations, providing means to evaluate the consequence of the security breach, making possible the audit. So does it sound feasible for the room, or it sounds useless, or next slide? Well, it's about testing. So, well, this is a text we added just not to have a control access that is well, to have the control access and any security associated to SFC in different level. So it is recommended that the user's access authorization be performed outside the SFC. In fact, granting access and treating the traffic are two different functions, and we recommend they remain separate. So well, the scope is really to make possible for someone that is deploying an architecture to say, I'm going to test this architecture. So I'm going to play the bad user, and I'm going to provide any traffic I want. So I might be blocked by the access controls. But if you really want to test your architecture, you want to say, I'm going to play the bad guy, and I want to see how it works. If you melt, or if you have this kind of signalings with SFC, then SFC can say, oh, yeah, in case you're a bad guy, this is how I'm going to behave. And in that case, you're not really testing your SFC deployment. So next slide. Well, we'll remove one must and a should. So, but as a recommendation, what is the value of must? Because we said, well, must means if you don't follow, we're not going to call the police. I mean, you're on your own. That's what we mean by must. But if people feel more at ease, we should, especially in that case. We're fine with that. So, but I think we need to define a little bit more what we understand with should, must in this specific context. And would be great to, if you have any opinion on that, that would be very helpful. Next slide. Yeah, this is about metadata. So actually this aspect has been discussed on the mailing list So we had a quite long text about specifying the motivation for protecting the metadata and explaining basically when you have to really protect them. And well, it's always a decision, a deployment decision. So next slide. So we'd like to understand what you think about this work, and what are the next steps you would like us to do. Any comments?
So that's Martin Stiemeling speaking as a random community member. I'm a bit surprised about let's say the content of the presentation / the draft, and because most of the things sound really fluffy. For instance, there was about metadata, which was like a lot of words. But what I missed is a bit like, okay, why is it dangerous that metadata could be exposed, and what are the countermeasures for this? That's more like a security analysis we usually do in the IETF. Because this was just saying, yeah, you need to prevent to leak it. Yeah, but how do you prevent it?
Well, if you don't want to expose, it's basically encrypting.
Right, but then the prevention is you encrypt the stuff.
Yeah, you can, but you can encrypt at different layers. So then you can choose using NSH, for example, or IPsec,
Right.
or.
But that's something you can name. You can say you can encrypt at different layers and discuss those layers and the pros and the cons.
Okay.
Yeah. Because the text is probably moving to the right direction, but it's really fluffy. And if you get this to the next level, the ISG, they will come back and saying like, oh, we don't know how you fix this stuff.
Okay, so I understand, and I mean, we removed any text that is really solution related. So maybe that was not what we should have done, or
Could be too early for solutions. Maybe it's better to start with the threads, and then in the course of the document you can actually work on the solutions afterwards. So, but it's like
okay,
that has to come at some point, I think.
okay.
Joe Scaragianis, Huawei. I have a question on where this draft applies. Is it to one domain, one SFC domain, or multiple domains? And this is related to the next topic that will be discussed, the hierarchical draft.
So you mean
I mean, are you considering that the security attacks and the solutions that you or the requirements that you are providing are related to one SFC domain? So the
I think so. I mean, depends what you call SFC domain, but I mean, well, the idea. I think one of the hypotheses of SFC is it's run in a single domain. So this is what we addressed. But what is two domains? Logically you can make two domains one domain. I mean, if you just have a VPN, so that's it. But I think it's one administrative domain. Yeah, that's it.
one administrative.
Yeah.
Diego Garcia del Rio from Nokia. No, my question was also, this feels a bit like a gap analysis of where there are holes in the implementation or the possible implementations, what holes there are, and what vulnerabilities there seem to be. But I think also it would probably be of value of discussing what the performance impact or the control plane impact of. I know you're not discussing solutions right now, but like authenticating the data plane to avoid header mishandling or header manipulation and so on could be an issue. And I feel there should be discussions as well what the performance impact, or you mentioned encryption. If suddenly we have to add encryption at every step of the way, there are quite serious performance implications in place there. So
Yeah, but in that case, I don't think we can end up with any consensus because if you're doing everything with software, everything with hardware, then you will have a big difference. And well, you have some performance aspects, but I think mostly is when you're dealing with security, it's mostly how you manage everything behind. That's I think the key problem. But you have some performance aspect. I think they are in the draft mentioned, but maybe not clearly. But we mentioned, yeah, I think for the encryption especially, we mentioned that it's might not be feasible for deployments to encrypt everything. So in that case, you have to rely on other assumptions.
So where one has to be careful is that, because you were saying the implementation, I think it's really difficult to discuss implementation details in a draft which should become an RFC later on. But in the respect you're right is that you need to think about, for instance, have you to encrypt and decrypt the data, for instance, at every hop. That will be a performance impact for everybody, independent if it's hard or software. The other hand, you can think about, are you encrypting 1 million different user sessions, or you're just encrypting 10 bulk sessions or so. And I think those considerations you can actually put in the draft, and they're also valuable. If it comes to saying like, well, this is probably faster in Linux or FreeBSD or in an ASIC, that's nothing for the draft. But it's right, the draft should think about on what is also the penalty or what would be the beneficial point to introduce a security measure.
yeah, or even the possibility of doing just signing of a packet with a secret, with a shared secret, as opposed to avoid manipulation. You don't care about the content, you just care about the packet was manipulated or not, or things like that. So,
right.
I think it's hard. It's like if you said, well, what is the cost of encapsulation? Because sometimes encapsulation costs more than encryption. So this is why I'm kind of reluctant to go into what is better, because it really depends on, well, the crypto algorithm, for example.
no, I agree, but I mean, if then the intent of the draft is to say, okay, you should have some protection, but if you're not going to define what the protection is going to be, you're going to end up with 27 non-interoperable implementations.
Well, I mean, so when you say, well, you have some kind of protection, I think we are a little bit more specific. We say encryption, authentication, or, well, basically that's the two main actions. And in that case, well, what we mean is that you have to rely on protocols that are doing these actions. So if you're using IPsec, you use IPsec. But IPsec, then we can say, well, it's one protocol. Or, I mean, any encryption option that's going to be designed for NSH. But then once you have defined the layer, you could say, oh, okay, but what is the encryption algorithm, or what is the authentication algorithm I'm going to use? And then it's another area of discussions. So maybe that's why the document looks a little bit fluffy.
Well, that's the question. Are you trying to just highlight the gaps, or are you hoping that this document will become and will, eventually define particular encryption or authentication mechanisms or so on?
No. We don't. Well, we don't even expect this document to provide some requirements about the NSH protocol. This is another document. We just want to provide some guidance on SFC deployment. And say, well, if you're doing, well, depending on your assumptions, if you say you trust everyone, then of course you don't need any security. But as long as something is going to happen, well, make sure your hypotheses are correct. And if you have different hypotheses, just take care about that, take care about that, take care about these aspects.
Hello, Philip Birdley. I apologize, I haven't read your document in detail, but I was just looking at it now. Something I would have found helpful is a clear description of what your scope is, because I don't think you're trying to talk about all the security problems for SFC. You're trying to talk about only some of them, and I couldn't understand what subset you were trying to talk about.
So I'm not sure I understand the
Well, your scope seems to be the SFC environment, but you don't say what, I mean, I couldn't find what environment meant. And then you said protocol stuff is out of scope, but I didn't really know what dividing line you had between stuff you were trying to talk about in this document and stuff you were trying to leave for somewhere else.
So are you saying that the document is not specific enough to SFC?
I didn't understand what the scope you were trying to talk about was. Because I can think of lots of problems, and I don't know whether they should be included or you were trying not to include them, because you were trying to leave it for something else to talk about those problems.
Well, the scope is really the deployment of a SFC. That's the scope. If you deploy,
so that's all problems to do with deploying SFCs.
I think that's probably a question back, because I'm not sure it's really only about deployment. Yeah.
So because if you deployed it, then you've presumably got to have solved all the problems, haven't you? I mean, it's not of how the protocol, the security of the protocol, that's part of the deployment. Security of all the individual functions, is that part of the deployment? I mean, so it's not, I don't think you quite, anyway, I couldn't understand it.
Well, what I take from the discussion is that we need to discuss between the chairs and the design team again to fix the scope really, so that you are sure what you're supposed to do and that there's no misunderstanding. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that was, he was first, I think.
Thanks. Rajiv Asari. I actually like the document, has a lot of good information, but I think you might want to consider just focusing on the requirements. I mean, right now on the document, I mean, I just glanced through it. It has the requirements as well as recommendations, as well as a lot of supporting information, why this makes sense, why this needs to be done. It might be useful for the document to focus on the requirements and not necessarily on the recommendations. That might help with fine-tuning the scope.
I would think about it, but the thing is that if you come with requirements, because these requirements are so much dependent on the environment you're deploying your SFC architecture, then you will end up with so many subcases. That's why we're switching a little bit more to recommendation, guidance, requirement. We have to rethink that. So a good, for me, a good question would be what you think is a recommendation, what you think is a requirement.
Recommendations could be generic, could be made very specific to the deployment model. I don't think the latter should be the goal. The former perhaps is a reasonable thing to do, but at minimum, requirements are going to be very clear that you could spell out no matter which use case, which deployment you look at in terms of the SFC and security. Then you could perhaps have another document that says, hey, here's the deployment scenario that we intend to focus on, and here are the recommendations that pertain to that deployment scenario.
Okay, so basically, what you're proposing is that we said, well, a trusted environment, which are the requirements, 1, 2, 3. This is a untrusted environment, these are the requirements, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, something along that line, and we could sync up offline. Thank you.
Okay.
This is coming from Java, from Joe Marcos. Let me read. Maybe related to the previous question, not this one, the 2 questions ahead. The draft says it's not trying to define protocol requirements, but in terms of cross-vendor compatibility, would the requirements not lead to a need to create some protocol requirements? For example, if you encrypt NSH, wouldn't you need multiple implementations to support common encryption?
So what is the question again?
My understanding of the question, and probably maybe Joe is not happy with that, is that in the moment you start with requirements, since we're talking about requirements on something that is protocol independent and is related to architecture, unless you map them into protocol requirements, the document will be somehow limited. That's my understanding. So what he is proposing somehow is that you try to land it somehow on NSH. Or that at the end, the natural evolution of this would be to land these requirements on NSH to start with.
So my understanding is that the question is when we say we have to encrypt this flow at the end, is it going to be NSH encryption at the end? I would say no, because it could be NSH, in which case, well.
Yeah, no, it's he's adding up something like, how do we ensure that multiple components implemented by multiple vendors support common security schemes?
Okay, so regarding SFC, that's going to be NSH, right? If you choose a lower layer, suppose encryption, I'm taking IPsec, well, then IPsec have to be implemented at both ends, but that's another layer. So what we say is that you don't have to do anything at the NSH layer. You might do this another layer. But of course, if you want to address the issue at the NSH layer, then, well, that's going to be NSH.
Smaller again. I think the security is a kind of a oddball thing for the operators. It depends. Good security means it's not in the way too much. But when I'm looking at this draft, I don't know whether it's a good or bad, because it doesn't tell me how much disruption it will cause into the operations. So I think first requirement I need to see is that, okay, A is required. B, if it is not, what are the other models I need to consider? And number C, I think what you are implying is that you are not going to propose a new security protocol to encrypt NSH. I'm not sure it's been ruled out, or it's you are saying so.
No, it's not this, well, defining requirements for NSH, the protocol itself, is outside the scope of this document.
Maybe, but if there is a new protocol that comes with it, that has a significant cost into adoption also. So personally, as an implementer, I would not like to see another protocol thrown at, which we have to deal with it. So that's what I mean by the operational ease. If I can take some of the protocols that already encrypt, provides authentication, provides services. Maybe there is a bit cost to it because we might be actually encrypting the whole payload instead of the NSH header, but it is justifiable from the operations point of view because I do not have to actually install, maintain, or learn something new. And it's actually, the implementers might be happy to write another program, but the operators won't like it. I'm pretty sure about that.
Okay, but what is not clear to me is when you say another protocol.
If we are to encrypt just the NSH header itself, then there has to be some key exchange or some shared secret, and then there has to be length encoded something. So once the VXLAN GP comes in, now we have to look at this new thing, decrypt it. All these things adds up to the process.
Yeah, that's
and I have to know whether it's encrypted or not also to begin with, because I might get encrypted header as well as unencrypted headers. So there is multiple steps to it.
But so what you don't want to is to implement these mechanisms, or do you prefer as an implementer saying, oh, you can do something different, a layer above?
No, I think implementers can do a lot of things, but operationally it's getting into the way of operations than solving actually the problem.
Okay. Yeah, I think if you have to encrypt whatever the layer is between two nodes, well, you have to agree on a key. So whatever the layer you're going to do the operation, it's going to be more or less, I think, the same problem, the same burden. So,
Okay.
any other comment?
Yeah, my sorry. My comment would be probably more to the community that this seems to require much more attention of the community and also input and more discussion on the list to figure out where to go forward, so that the design team is there to make some progress, but having a design team doesn't mean that the working group is out of service. Yeah. Okay, good.
Okay, so feel free to send on the mailing list, but I don't, well, from the reaction, I don't really understand how we can move forward.
Yeah.
So that's something.
I guess it's, I think the next step will be that the chairs and you from the design team, we're gonna, either by email or on a phone call, we chat how we continue, and then we go to the working group. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right.
Feel free to send feedbacks. I mean, they're always useful. I mean, and if you think I did not understand or did not respond to your comment, that's really useful to resend that on the mailing list. Thank you.
Yeah, and we had those discussion here, and also the comment from Jabber. Go to the, we have the mailing list posted there, so that this discussion is keep rolling. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Now we have David.
Hi, I'm David Olson, presenting for hierarchical service function chaining. We're on version 5, and you can see a list of authors that we've got there. Next slide, please. So a quick history. This concept was introduced in draft HOMA SFC forwarding methods analysis, and it was considered interesting enough that people wanted to see it broken out into its own draft. So we posted that draft in May last year, proposing some ideas, and we iterated a couple of times on it. We're now up to version 5, and most recently, we've incorporated changes from draft SFC for DC interconnect, which I'll talk about later. So next slide, please. So just a quick summary of what this is about. This is, hierarchical approach is thinking about how to break down a complicated system into simpler systems. So we think about a high level, a service chain that goes across a very large network with a lot of components in it. And we can talk about chains that visit, say, a data center as though it were a service function. So we abstract an entire, it doesn't have to be an entire data center. It can be, a rack or a component, but it's an abstraction. So then within the subdomain, we can again classify and service chain through various functions. So really this is about making a hard problem simpler by the magic of hierarchically breaking things down. Next slide, please. I'll remind you that we introduced the component called an internal boundary node. It's a variant of the one in RFC 7665. That's the SFC architecture. But we've talked about behavior that's not mentioned in that architecture. So what we've tried to do is explain how to do this IBN behavior, to do it safely, to how to do it properly. It's I guess it's an architecture approach as well. Next slide, please. So thinking about what needs to happen here when a packet comes from the higher level domain and goes into a subdomain and gets reclassified. The chaining information is removed from the packet, well, possibly, and it goes through the lower level service chain. And then when it needs to return again to the higher level service chain, which path do you put the packet on? So we've come up with 4 different options. One is to be stateful in the IBM. So this device would remember based on, say, flow information, which path each tuple is supposed to go on, would be one way of looking at it. Another approach is to encode the higher level information as metadata in lower level metadata, so that when the packet needs to go back to the higher level chain, the information is there in the metadata. Third option is actually create unique lower level paths for each upper level path. That can be a bit of a combinatorial explosion, however. And the new one that we've added in this draft is the nesting of NSH within NSH. And there was a fair amount of conversation about this on the mailing list. And next slide, please. Because this, roughly speaking, is the stack now in the packet, with the top would be like the encapsulation, then a lower NSH. So I guess, sorry, start from the bottom. With the original packet, it's already inside an NSH header. There'll be more encapsulation again. So one nice thing about this is it simplifies the IBN. It makes it stateless for sure. It doesn't have to remember anything. It doesn't have to do a lot of magic, but it does require the service function be able to parse through this stack and so on. And it also requires allocating a new value for next protocol. We currently have IPv4, IPv6, and Ethernet. So this would mean we should have NSH as the next header value. Next slide, please. Should also say that there's, I was informed of an implementation of this hierarchical service chaining. I've included a link here to Victor Vu's presentation. He's done it using Open Daylight. And the method he chose was to take the upper level path information and encode it as metadata in the lower level path, and then restore it again. I encourage you to take a look at those slides, but and that's just an insert from his slide deck there in the corner. It's showing using Open Daylight and Open vSwitch and other common components. Next slide, please. We also have some, one of the things we think about with this is the control plane implications. Being aware that an IBN is both a service function and it also has roles of classifier and SFF in the lower level. So to make this work in an elegant and manageable way, we want these to be treated independently. So I guess really here is think about, when you're working on control plane stuff, to realize that a particular box might have more than one function. So, don't use the same port for service functions and classifiers or however it's working. Just something to keep in mind there. Next slide, please. So there are also some metadata implications here. It's like the service path information that's in the higher level domain. If there's metadata in the higher level domain, we need to figure out what to do with that too. So there's a couple of approaches. One is to use the same metadata schema across high and low domains. And the other approach is to find some way of pushing or popping or statefully remembering this information. Next slide, please. So here's some of the value we think we're providing here. So we think that providing, scalability to really large networks, like, thousands, tens of thousands of devices. And the benefit here is that we can, hide a lot of this inside the subdomains. In some cases, some applications of service chaining want to do kind of like per TCP flow, figure out what kind of protocol it is, set a different path. We don't think that's feasible to do at the high level, at the edge nodes. There could be a lot of different boxes that need to be updated. We think that's something that's appropriately done in the subdomain. And that's another feature. I can take a question now if you have one. Is that okay?
Rajiv Asari. I certainly agree hiding in some sense always a reasonable thing to do in a large scale environment. But in this specific context, I'm scratching my head, trying to figure out if we were to do the trace routing and SFC trace routing, you have this nestedness, and the packet gets dropped or expires at the sub level. How does that get handled? So that's question one. Question two is in terms of mapping of the metadata or processing of the metadata. So if a metadata gets changed at the sub level, do you suppose getting that propagated up to the parent level or not? If there are any rules that have been defined, would appreciate some clarity.
Okay, I'll take one at a time.
Please.
So, sorry. So I guess on to the second one first. The metadata. I guess it comes down to: are you? One approach is they could share shared schema, right? So that if you change metadata in the subdomain, you actually intend for that to be changed in the higher level domain. And to me, that seems the same as a service function changing metadata. So the packet goes into the subdomain, it comes out with different metadata. That's as though the service function changed it. Another approach could be that you don't want to share the metadata in the lower level domains, in which case you, and that's where you start talking about pushing it or saving it away to restore it. I'm sort of thinking that the most common case will be there won't be a lot of metadata from the higher level domain, that most of it will be added in the lower level domains, but that just might be the way I'm thinking of it. And sorry, the first question again, what was, give me a hint, what that was?
Sure, that was the SFC trace routing or
yeah.
OAM stuff.
I'm not super familiar with the approaches you're thinking of, but if a packet's lost or a packet's dropped because it hits, it runs out of a lookup table, right, or it hits a lookup table that there's no forwarding entry for. Well, certainly expected to be counted, but actually, sorry, I don't think I can intelligently answer that question. But
that's
I guess
fine.
you want to be, thinking about it off the cuff. I think you'd want it to look as though the high-level service function dropped it, right? If it was dropped within a within a subdomain to the higher-level domain, you'd want it to look as though that service function dropped it.
Yeah, that could be one way of approaching it, because and depending on how the connectivity model is working out, which brings me to actually the third question I wanted to ask. So I'm looking at the topology on slide 7. Is the presumption that SF actually is also the SFF for the subdomain? Otherwise, wouldn't each of these sub SF be directly connected to SFF2? SFF2 is the one that connects to the security subdomain.
I can't actually read it from here. So the gateway node, the IBN, has I think an SFF feature in it, is when the packets need to be returned to that gateway. So that means it is an SFF in the sense that the last service function in the subdomain decided to forward the packet to it. And then because that's a terminating, there should be a terminating entry for that SFF. Now, instead of just routing that packet, you know, it's got to take that and put it back in the upper level service chain. So it's kind of an SFF with a special kind of termination. That's how I see it.
Okay.
Does that answer?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, back
Thanks.
to, where were we? Okay, contributions. So we think this can lead to simpler controllers at all levels. So instead of, you know, one big controller that knows about all paths through all devices in my network, I can reason about controllers at the high level, which may be, you know, have fairly simple objectives, but over a wide area network, you know, to get certain classes of users to go to certain subdomains. That may sound simple, but it may be a lot of devices to manage, and that may be enough. And then in each subdomain, you can focus on individual problems, like you can have a subdomain that's about security functions or DDoS scrubbing or things like this, where, you know, those are hard problems too. And you don't want to have to worry about, you know, all the traffic coming from all the edges of your network and dealing with that. You just, well, the traffic arrived at my subdomain, let's do the right thing. So by defining this function, this is, you know, we think this is a contribution as well. And I think I have another slide or two. Yeah, so the status of this document, we've got contributions from several authors. I know quite a few other people have reviewed it as well. We've got some feedback. I think we've addressed all of that feedback, although we could certainly have some more feedback to perhaps narrow some of the design decisions. We've got, as you know, few different approaches that could work. Different people's opinions about what's good or bad about those would be useful. And we think with the interest and the continued interest and the value of this, that we would like the working group to adopt this. You know, I heard this again from my co-authors. You know, make sure, you know, we really want to see this adopted and continued. So I don't know how that works. But,
Yeah, so.
and I think, is that my last slide there?
Yeah, I think-
Yes, I guess a benefit of the adoption would be, we'd really like to get people looking at it, more scrutiny and, you know, more formal process to give this, because I've seen a lot of interest from people. They want to do this.
Yeah, maybe the first question would be, oh, just go ahead. So if you.
I had a different question going back to the draft, if that's okay. I know you moved on to asking about the working group adoption or something. Is that okay if I still ask you the question?
Yeah, sure.
So I was looking at the subdomain classifier, and I was trying to figure out what, I mean, does it really take encapsulate the frame of the packet first and then classify the packet in the subdomain, or it really takes the packet as it enters the subdomain and actually does the classification on the outer overlay header?
So I think it's looking at the inner packet. I mean, it can use some properties of the outer, of the actual path it's on. You know, in some cases, the path is important. You may want different policies on different paths or things like this. But that's not necessary, I don't think. Just, you know, so I think it's reasonable to pop the packet out of the NSH header, maybe consider the metadata even that's with it, but, you know, pop it out, classify it, send it through a new chain. When it comes back, get it back into the correct path again.
So I must apologize, I'm probably confused, because somewhere when I glanced through the section, it seemed to indicate that the packet, when it enters subdomain, is just imposed with yet one more NSH header. And that packet is what just processed through the subdomain, and then the second level header is removed, and then it goes back into the parent domain. That's what probably I understood, but.
That's one of the solutions to the
Oh.
problem of how to deal with it. So that was the new approach. That's got the benefit of less state in the IBN, but more burden, I think, on the service functions.
Yeah, because it has to, I mean, not service function as well as SFF to a degree, because you gotta be able to look at the actual original payload of a packet to begin with to do the processing.
Well, the SFF only needs to look at the first one. It doesn't need to peel back past the first header. So it doesn't need, I don't think it adds any burden to the SFF.
When the packet comes back into the sub SFF1 or the sub SFF2, well, then you still need to process that, right? So if you have both of those headers in place, then the outer.
Well, I guess it needs to remove it. And
so yeah, that's what I meant. To a degree, SFF needs to care for that as well. Like, it becomes a little bit more complex than I want to scratch my head with, but thank you.
I think it's complex, but it's also, I think, incredibly useful.
Robert Sabo Eriksson. Can you go back to slide number 3? I'm a bit confused
slide?
on the
I think
use
it's at
case. Slide number 3,
I didn't get it. Which slide?
actually. I wonder if you are forwarding the traffic to a subdomain, there must be a service function, right? So you have to have a kind of service function abstraction, decomposition. When you go into the subdomain, you will have several service functions there, and you forward the traffic there. But even in the overarching view, in the global view, you have to have some kind of service function in order to go to that domain.
Sorry,
So
I'm having trouble hearing you, Robert.
Okay. So slide number 3.
3.
3, yes.
There we go.
Yeah, this. So if I have a look at the subdomain 1, there are service functions. But in the global picture, there are no service functions. So why do I go to subdomain 1 in the first place?
Subdomain 1 is a service function
Is a service function.
in the higher level.
Okay. So then maybe you should show this on the higher level. And then there must be, so the service is defined in the global picture, and you just decompose the service into subcomponents in subdomain 1. And then why do you need any further forwarding? You have the 1-1 association of the high level service function and the forwarding, and also the same association is present in the subdomain. You can do whatever you wish based on the classified text. So I don't know, I don't frankly understand why the hierarchies you need here.
Are you suggesting it's all a control plane problem? Yeah.
Yeah,
We,
to some
we
extent,
closed
this
the
is-
mic, so just, Diego, are you queuing up or? Because I wanted to close the mic. Okay.
Yep.
So
I'm suggesting that this is mostly a control plane issue, and when you do the deployment,
But
this.
right, I see what you mean. So right, so you could say it's just a control plane issue. Let's do perhaps even hierarchical control plane. But part of the reason for this is to actually have different controllers in the different domains and isolate them even from failure that way. So we don't have a God controller, that has to figure out everything.
Okay, that makes sense.
Kent,
Yes. Kent?
are you done? Okay, Kent Leon. So actually, I just want to go back to the earlier remark about the classification in the subdomain. So to me, it seems that we should be prescriptive, in terms of not being able to take advantage of the outer NSH header as far as the metadata, as well as the, additional information, right? When you're doing the internal classification, right? I mean, to me, is that you can look at the user traffic, and on top of that, you can look at the outer NSH before you decide, what needs to be done within the subdomain. I mean, just a comment, basically. Was there a reason that you wanted to strip it completely out and only look at the user traffic?
I think it's reasonable to look at the path that it comes in to the subdomain as well as the metadata.
Okay. As long as
Not-
we don't prevent that, I think that's fine. I mean, it's up to the internal SFC classification policy to decide how to classify that within the subdomain, right?
Yeah, I think that could be, I don't think we need to prescribe that. I think, the packets are coming in with a header on it, they're leaving with a different header, and there are a lot of ways in which you could determine what that would be. Thanks.
Okay, good. So there was the question about if this should be a working group item. So it's not a place here to decide this. What I encourage people is maybe to think about it and give some feedback on the list. And we're probably going back to this question on the list to figure out if this is something the working group is interested in or not. But what I've seen right now, at least there is a good discussion here. So there seems to be some interest, and we need to follow up this on the list then. Okay.
And then please track me down later in the week or later today if you want to talk. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then Sunil, you can, if he's here, no, I just try to get the slides up. So let's see what happens. Here we go. Okay.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sunil from F5. Actually, I was not prepared for the presentation, so I have this sort of slides, so if there's any mistakes, please bear with me. Okay, the topic of the proposal is basically metadata. We know metadata is an important part of SFC in general. The past few slides, it has brought up, and there's a lot of interest on it. It's also one of the areas where there's not clear direction or definitions. The idea of this proposal is to bring out those requirements and also kind of have a proposal how vendors can incorporate. If you look at it in SFC, the value add for metadata, be it NSH or SFC in general, is for SFs. So it's while the path ID and service index are used for traffic steering, a lot of value add as a value-added service, SFs needs this metadata for communication, which is what one NSH provides. And this proposal also fits in SFC in general and also aligns very much in line with the NSH proposal. So it's applicable in a generic case and a specific case of this NSH. And here, what have also one the point to mention is, if we don't have a clear definition of the metadata and intercommunication of SFs using this metadata in a common language, implementations will change. They'll be go from in-band to out-of-band mechanisms. Like if you have two vendors, SF1 and SF2 from different vendor products, to communicate, they'll have the hard code values or have out-of-band mechanisms. So we're trying to eliminate all that because of scale and performance. This metadata addresses two broad buckets. Just call it a generic SFs, basically metadata for generic SFs, and metadata for vendor-specific SFs, how to communicate. Next slide, please. Okay. The problems, as mentioned, is in a service chain, we know there can be multiple SFs in a chain, and it can vary depending on the subscriber. It can vary a lot of parameters as set by the controller. So one of the main thing comes, we have many vendors and have product capabilities. How do the vendors kind of leverage their capabilities in SFC? That's one of the primary concerns. Next one is the NSH draft basically does not go into semantics as of a metadata, just talks about MD type 2 as a TLV, doesn't go into the details of semantics, which this proposal talks about. And lastly, I mentioned the is the semantics is critical because it's not just at the L2 or L3 communication, it's how the SFs get this metadata and use it both the receive side and the transmit side. So,
If I can, this is Joel Halpern with Ericsson. If I can make a few comments. First off, the key we normally turn to for interoperability is standardization. Even if we don't want to standardize metadata, and there will be many non-standardized metadata, we can maintain a public registry with pointers to the definitions so that people can interoperate when they are willing to make public their meaning. We do not need a formal descriptive form about the metadata. And conversely, I have not seen anything in your framework that actually addresses the problems that occur when you try to get interoperability between vendors with regard to metadata. So yes, we need to originate packets with metadata. There are some very interesting, challenging problems. David sent a nice note to the list this morning, I think, pointing out that there are some really underspecified issues here that we need to figure out how to address. But a framework for describing metadata doesn't seem to address any of them. I'm really sorry to have to say that.
next question.
Actually, I don't have a question. Actually, I do have a comment on this. Maybe it's related to what Joel just said, right? What I see, what the issue is, what's been brought out is a critical bit, for metadata, right? And when you talk about interoperability, I'm actually seeing a little gap there as far as different vendors, like you said, have their own service functions and they want to interoperate. But the critical bit in the NSH metadata today, if you don't understand it, then you have to drop the packet, right? So to me, that creates some interoperability issue because you have different vendors with different SFs in the service path. Maybe that critical bit is for metadata for a particular vendor-specific class. But then I guess what I see as being underspecified or not being clear today for metadata exchange is, if I set vendor one sets a critical bit because it needs to make sure that its instances know how to deal with it. When it's going through the path, vendor two's SF sees that, drops the packet, doesn't seem to make sense, right? So I'm not sure that we've addressed that part for interoperability for the metadata exchange. That might be part of maybe NSH, but I'm not sure if it's being covered in this. I haven't read this draft, so.
Okay, I think it'll be a little clearer as we go. I have one slide. I didn't have a chance to complete the use case, but I'll try to address some of it. Next slide. Okay, so basically this model supports both MD type 1 and 2. It's nothing anything specific with that. It just provides a framework. As Joel mentioned, it's we are not defining the global registry per se, or we're not defining the specific metadata definitions per se, because every domain and every vendor has different requirements. Like for example, mobility, broadband, there are already metadata proposals on those on a domain specific, and similarly on vendor specific, each vendor can have on a per product a different metadata capabilities. Because all metadata just is what are the capabilities where the controller can coordinate with SF and also program the actions accordingly based intelligently on the vendor. Because without this, it's just traffic steering. And yeah, this again a rough sketch. I don't have it completed yet. Quickly to go through it is basically SFF, the two yellow boxes in the second and the third, they could be from different vendors. And the top small boxes are service functions from vendors V1, V2, V3, V4. One example use case is if a vendor V1 knows something about vendor V2, could be a firewall and DPI, for example, and there is some way of signaling via metadata saying that, yes, I got for this path service index for this subscriber, yada, yada, yada. I process the packet, this firewall function. I suspect something malicious, or I suspect something, is like a hint to the next guy in the hop. And that could be generic or vendor specific. If it is generic, it can use one of the generic metadata types. If it is vendor specific, then it can intelligently signal the other SF with that vendor specific information, so that the receiving SF, which is SF2, could be a could be a DPI, can intelligently act on a packet, and actions can be different based on subscriber, based on the vendor, based on a lot of different parameters. Next slide. This is the initial proposal. I would encourage everybody to read through it, come back with comments and suggestions and use cases. We are going to also update it with further use cases, so that for those who are not clear can to get basically, we are introducing simple where there'll be YANG models, how to define a generic metadata for a particular domain or for particular vendor types. So there will be YANG models defined for the easy and extendability. Any questions? Sorry.
Yeah, on the Rajiv Asari, on the previous slide, please. I was trying to relate it to your explanation with what the SFF or SF may have to do. So if SF is a vendor V1 and SF, the second one is V2, how would SF V1 know what it needs to include in the metadata based on what type of that service function vendor really is? And I think as point was made earlier, there could be hundreds of different vendors. So how do we intend to accommodate for that variability?
Yes. Am I ready? Can I answer?
Yes, please, go ahead.
That's a very good point. And there is we understand the problem and the solution for that. The solution for that is this. When the controller, right, provisions the SF, there's an abstract notation and there's a rendered specific notation. Like even when you have an SFC, you can have an abstract chain, and from the abstract chain, you derive the rendered service path, right? Do you understand the difference between the rendered service path and an abstract path? So in the process of that, right, that's what I'm saying. When it function and programs the rendered service path, this is one thing where the controller can notify, communicate to SFs what intelligently to do, because the controller has a global view, right? It renders the service path, give you a specific path ID, specific service ID, right? So with that, it can also say, hey, SF1, SFV1 in this case, for this key, I'll call it generically key, path ID, service ID, VLAN ID, whatever you want. This flow basically has your V2, and by the way, V2 is this kind of metadata. It is optional, it's not mandatory. If it wants to, leverage it. If it does not want to leverage it, it can fall back to the domain-specific generic types. Even that if V2 is not supported, it can still notify saying that V2 doesn't support. So don't even bother on your transmit, latching in anything. So there are multiple models, use cases that can be supported.
So we only have 2 minutes left. So maybe Dave can ask the question. And where are the blue sheets?
Thanks.
Yeah. Did anybody not sign the blue sheet? Then it's still time. Maybe you can just, yeah. There's the second blue sheet somewhere. Just pass it up front, please. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. I was just thinking about what Joel said at the microphone. I don't know what you think about this, Sunil, but maybe this is not, maybe we haven't quite hit on the right way to talk about it, Joel, but maybe there's, I think there's a gap in how we're talking about metadata, and if we can come up with a framework for how people can talk about metadata and make them interoperate, maybe that's where we should go about this. So, not to say, these are all the types of metadata that there are, but to say, when you're talking with another vendor about metadata, these are the classes of metadata, and these are the terminologies you use.
Yes. And vendors can add metadata, domains can add, data types and new buckets.
Okay, we are out of time.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. I need the other blue sheet. One is up front here. There's a second one. That's only one, isn't it? So, okay, thank you. Where's the second blue sheet? It's gone. That's bad. Okay, I have to look it up. Okay, thank you. That's the end of the session. Thanks for being here, and see you in Berlin. Goodbye. Where's the blue sheet? Convenient.